Hey, how's it going and welcome to this year's final Jojo June video. So I hope you all enjoyed Jojo June this year. I'm really glad we decided to do it for, this is the third Jojo June. We do it every 2 years. Maybe we'll do another one in 2021, maybe we'll just stick to the plan and do it in 2022, but either way, Jojo June, and like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure in general, holds a very special place in my heart. Back when we did the first Jojo June, all the way back in 2016, I think we only had around 1,000 subscribers. We probably had less, actually. I don't know if we even reached that milestone, but I remember the very first piece of fan art we ever got was because of a Jojo June video. So there's just a lot of memories attached to Jojo June in the series in general. And it's crazy to think I've been into the series for almost 10 years. Like, I got into it with the 2012 anime, the Phantom Blood anime. So I'm not quite part of the old guard. The guys who got into it when it was just the manga. But I've definitely been around, so I've kind of seen the birth and evolution of what I guess you could call the modern JoJo fanbase. I've been through seeing the announcement of every anime of, All-Star Battle when that was coming out, Eyes of Heaven, which I never actually played, but I've seen the growth of it ever since 2012, and with Jojo June, I like to end the month with kind of a reflection on the series as a whole. Last year, I did a trip down JoJo's Bizarre Memory Lane, where I talked about my experiences getting into the series and reading the manga and everything. And so I figured it'd be fun to kind of take a look back at how people's opinions on every part have kind of changed throughout the years. And obviously, I have to preface this one by saying I have not spoken to every fan of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure about every part, and everybody's different. This is more just kind of a general summation based on what I've seen, people I've talked to, videos I've watched. So it's just a generalization. Like, if I happen to say, I don't know, something about part 3 that you don't conform to, then don't take it personally. It's just kind of like, it's just a general thing. Everybody's obviously different. If you don't want to get spoiled, then dip out, when I get to the part I'm about to talk about. So, Part 1. Part 1 has had a very interesting journey of people's kind of perceptions and opinions on it. And the general sort of vibe that I would get from the community at large was kind of this idea that, Part 1 is the thing you get through to get to the good stuff. In general, I feel like, going back to 2012 especially, people would get through it and think, oh, that was fine. But it was never really discussed a whole lot. And it was actually pretty common to see Part 1 be people's least favorite. That's even true today. Just because it is so different from the rest of it. You show an unsuspecting person a manga page from Part 1 and then show them something from Part 6. I assume, they would not make the assumption that they're the same manga at all. But yeah, it was not uncommon to see people say that it was bad. Or at least bad in comparison to the rest of it. This is gonna freak people out for anybody who got into it recently who doesn't know the hubbub about, how Part 5 was perceived. I'll get to that in a bit, but it was not uncommon to see people say Part 5 and Part 1 are, at the bottom. And in recent years, there's definitely been a lot more of a resurgence of Part 1 love. And I don't know how much of that is, super genuine of, I always liked Part 1 the most, or whatever. I don't think too many people would say Part 1 is their favorite, but... And this is, always kind of sort of been a thing, but there's also this very fascinating, cult of, I only like Parts 1 and 2 of JoJo. There's, that crowd that I find really weird. I kind of get it because Stans and the Hamon are so different, but... So that's kind of Part 1. I feel like there hasn't really been a radical shift in people's opinions of it. Most will say it's either fine to pretty good, and then we have Part 2, Battle Tendency. So, I think the kind of change in people's perceptions and opinions on Part 2 is maybe the most fascinating one. But back in, 2012, 2013, the general sort of feel was alright, Part 1, that's fine, but then you get to Part 2, and that's when it gets good. And I already feel the cringe emanating from some, Part 2 detractors. Don't shoot the messenger. This is just what I perceived. So, I have a very distinct memory of a friend of mine who was getting into, JoJo. He actually started by reading the manga, which is pretty uncommon. It was pretty uncommon back then, I should say. And I remember him talking about how much more entertaining and fun Part 2 is. And that was sort of how people felt. And, that's how I felt as well. From the moment Joseph pulls out the fucking Tommy gun and just blasts Straight-So, it's this is different. And even now, I'm genuinely struggling to remember back then ever having any particular interactions with anybody who were like, man, part 2 sucks. You know, if you said that you liked part 1 more than 2, you would get looked at like funny. Like, you'd get virtually looked at funny. But after a while, something about people's, I don't know, perception of part 2 changed a lot. And it makes me wonder how much of it was like, I don't know, just shadow people who always hated part 2 and just emerged, like, suddenly? Or how much of it is a genuine sorta, oh, this isn't as good as I thought kind of thing. But that just kind of naturally happens whenever anything is maybe overly praised or overly hyped. A kind of counterculture starts to brew against it, but it's one of those things where I genuinely do understand, like, all the criticism of it, because part 2 does not have good writing, like, at all. Like, Caesar's whole existence is a retcon, because, William originally said that he didn't have any kids, and so Jonathan was like a son to him, and then Caesar shows up and it's like, oh, I guess he was just wrong or lying, I don't know. And Joseph does pull a lot of stuff out of his ass, but, I don't know, I guess in my mind, I never viewed part 2 as, like, a bastion of good writing. It was just some fun, entertaining schlock, right? In my mind, there's a difference between something that, you know, pretends to have good writing and something that just admits that it's stupid and goofy, and part 2 is definitely more like, it just admits that it's dumb. Like, it's not trying to have some deep theme or write the most intricate characters ever written. It's just stupid work of shit. It's like, it's fun. But yeah, part 2 has definitely had a very interesting sort of reversal. Like, back in the day, it used to be, oh man, you, like, read through Phantom Blood because you gotta get to that battle tendency. And now it's a lot more 50-50. There's definitely still a lot of fans. Like, I still really like part 2 a lot. And then we get to part 3, and I feel like people's kind of opinions of part 3 haven't changed a whole lot. To where it's generally pretty liked, but I feel like it's a lot more common to see, oh, my favorite part is part 4, or 5, or 7. Whereas part 1 had that era of being, I don't know, I guess underappreciated, and then part 2 was arguably maybe overappreciated, and is now perhaps liked, less than it should be. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Part 3 has always been kinda steady. There's never any great upheaval about how underrated part 3 is. I guess that's partly due to the fact that it is so popular in general. It's one of those things where a lot of people might like part 4 or 5 or 7 or whatever more, but everybody knows part 3. Everybody knows Jotaro and Dio, you know, even though he's from Phantom Blood, whatever. It's kind of like the McDonald's of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. You know, it's pretty alright. You know what you're gonna get into. And part 4 is kind of a similar story. I feel like people have always been pretty positive when it comes to part 4. I'm glad there's never been a cultural uprising of part 4 bad, because I think I'd lose my mind. You know, some people like Stardust Crusaders more. They're just more into the sense of adventure, or the characters, or whatever. But no, part 4 has always been pretty liked. I feel like it's very common to see people say that part 4 is their favorite, including me. And then we come to part 5, which has, I would say this one has had the most complicated and interesting journey of any of the parts. A very weird journey. Almost like a bizarre adventure. So back in a bygone era, before, like, I think this was even before the part 3 anime was announced, was when I first read through the manga up to part 7. And it was very, very common to see people have part 5 as their least favorite part. Now, what we didn't know at the time was that the translation was really bad. I mean, some of us knew, but, like, we'll get into that in a bit. But I'd say probably the biggest complaint about it was just how flat a lot of the characters felt, and the dialogue wasn't very interesting. And even though the fights were good, it's kind of hard to, like, really get into a JoJo fight unless you understand what they're saying. This caused a lot of problems with a certain King Crimson. So, like, you know, not understanding fully what's going on, the fights kind of just become motion, you know? So even though the fights themselves were drawn well and whatever, it didn't feel right. So that's kind of where it stood for a while. And you would always hear these murmurings about the bad translation, right? And I feel like almost the sort of perception of that to a lot of people was that was an excuse, I guess? Because to many of us, a bad translation meant, you know, Duwang. Just like some barely comprehensible, what is it? I think it's Japanese to Chinese to English insane person translation. And for many of us, I guess it was just easier to kind of accept the reality of the part itself is bad, the translation is fine, it's just the characters are boring, rather than accept that the translation is bad, which is like a really weird, backwards, fucked way of thinking, you know? And I guess part of it was just kind of the irritation factor involved with people always telling you, no, it's just the translation that's bad, you're wrong. Because I remember getting very irritated back in, like, I think I even bring this up in the 2018 Jojo June videos we did with Medi, the part 5 ones. I remember mentioning the frustration that was involved with, like, anytime you would ever criticize part 5, people would go, did you read the bad translation? You know, that's basically a non-existent problem now, because you're 99.999% of the time, you're either gonna just watch the anime, which is translated fine, or you're gonna read JoJo's Colored Adventure. I feel like you would have to go more out of your way to track down the original, like, the shitty translation. But yeah, that would always kind of irritate me whenever, like, they were right at the end of the day, but that would always just sort of get on my nerves whenever any criticism of part 5 was just, did you read the bad translation? So that's how it was for a few years. Part 5 was the part that most people kind of agreed was bad, but there was always that looming feeling of like, okay, is it the translation, or is it like, what's going on with this fucking part? And then the good translation eventually got finished, and people's perceptions of it definitely improved a lot. But I feel like it was when the anime came out, that was when the crowd of, you know, part 5 is a masterpiece started to emerge. And going back to what I said about part 2, I almost wonder the inverse about part 5. If there was just like a lot of people that were bitter about the reputation that the part had, and then after they kind of had their chance, they started to double down on, you know, saying positive things about it. It's like, I like part 5 a lot. If you watched my tier list, I rated almost every part 5 character pretty highly. But my soul isn't quite attached to it the way it is with part 4 or 7. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to think just like how, as English speakers or any non-Japanese language, how susceptible we are to like having our opinions about Japanese media, affected by the translation. And then that gets into, you know, the exact same thing that happened with part 5, where people are like, no, it's a masterpiece, just in Japanese. So I don't know, it's just kind of interesting to think about. So yeah, part 5, very tumultuous journey. Went from, in the West, one of the least enjoyed parts to, it's pretty, like, common now to see people say that part 5 is their favorite or is the best or whatever. So it's definitely a glow up. I guess time will tell if we'll see, like, if it just has some kind of recency bias to where it's the newest one, therefore it's the best. Because, you know, that tends to happen with people, but we'll just have to see. So, part 6. Part 6 has been an interesting one, to say the least. You know, don't kill me if part 6 is your favorite part, but I feel like now that part 5 is, you know, gets all the praise that it gets, and people are a little more appreciative of part 1, I feel like this and Battle Tendency are the parts that it's the most common to see is, like, as people's least favorites. Including myself, I do feel like Stone Ocean is my least favorite part of the series. I feel like it was a little bit more liked back in, you know, the bad translation of part 5 days, because people would go from part 5, which was translated abysmally, to part 6, which is better. And now that part 6 is written closer to, you know, the way Araki actually writes things, the fights are perceived of as being better, suddenly people are like, oh wow, this is better than part 5. And now that it doesn't have the part 5 is bad thing to fall back on, it feels like people's opinions of it have really started to go downwards. Like, I don't want to sit here and give a whole essay on my dislike of some of the elements of part 6, but it just feels like people are very meh on the part in general. And I do wonder how much, if a part 6 anime gets made, how much that would change things. I feel like, you know, recency bias will obviously boost its, you know, its popularity up. So we'll see if, you know, if it gets made, when it gets finished, if people are like, wow, part 6, that masterpiece. Or if we'll see a new wave of, I didn't like that. So we'll just have to see. You can never quite tell with this kind of stuff. And then Steel Ball Run is another one that's always been pretty consistently, you know, praised over here. I kind of feel like if you're the kind of guy who goes and you start talking shit about part 7, you get funny internet looks. There are definitely a lot of people who think that part 7 is overrated or overhyped. And I do get that. I feel like Part 7 especially has kind of a reputation that is like, it's so hard for the story to actually live up to. You know, when you go around telling people, oh, it's gonna blow your mind, it's amazing, it's the greatest story ever made, and then people go into it and it's like, it's, you know, pretty good, then people are like, wow, it was overrated. But that just happens with basically everything. But no, Part 7 is another one along with, like, you know, Part 4 that has always been pretty consistently praised. You almost always see it in people's, you know, top 3, or at least the top half of the parts. You know, I sure as hell have sucked off Steel Ball Run's dick in quite a few different videos, but, I mean, it's good shit, dude. And then there's Jojo, which I'm hesitant to even talk about because it's not finished, but I've been saying it's not finished yet for 8 years at this point. I feel like it's super common to hear people say, I'll just, read it when it's finished, which is like, that's the camp that I'm in. But people's Jojo opinions are definitely pretty split. I see a lot of people say that it's a masterpiece. I see a lot of people say that it's just like, it's just kind of shitty and boring. I kind of fall into the camp of like, I'm just not particularly super enthralled by it. Some stuff in it I found super engrossing and like interesting and got me hooked. And then I would read some chapters and be like, man, I just don't care that much. But I also haven't read a new chapter of it in quite a while. I guess that kind of tells the story of where I'm at with Jojo. Maybe it'll finish and I'll read through it and I'll be like, oh man, that was so fucking good. But, you know, obviously the people who are into Jojo are really into it. But I also feel from kind of the general fan base, I don't know, a lack of urgency when it comes to Jojo, which is kind of strange. I wonder how much of that has to do with just the fact that Jojo has been going on for so long. You know, when I got into Jojo was the new thing. Like, Jojo started in 2011, and then the anime started in 2012. So when I got into it, Jojo was, it was like a year old or a year and a half. So it was like new, it was fresh, and now here we are nearly a decade later, and Jojo's just, you know, it's still going. Obviously this is a, you know, a hindsight is 2020 kind of thing, but I think in an alternate reality where right now Steel Ball Run is the new thing, right? Like, Steel Ball Run is the manga that every month we get a new chapter. I would be reading that shit every month. I feel like I've been saying this about Jojo for 5 or 6 years at this point, of just like, yeah, we'll have to wait and see what happens, you know? But that's kind of just where I'm at with Jojo, and I feel like I talked more about myself when it came to that one than anybody else, but... So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my retrospective on, I guess, other people's opinions on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Obviously, just generalizations, just kind of how I've perceived how things have changed over the years. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you all so much for watching. Thanks for another great Jojo June, and I'll see you guys next time.